Hey everybody, Coldar here. Today we are looking at Heroic Lei Shi and Terrace Spring. So this video starts a couple seconds into the encounter. I apologize for that. This fight on Heroic, however, is really not all that difficult. It's probably the easiest one in this zone, Terrace Spring. And the difficulty will depend greatly on your overall strategy. Basically how you handle the primary mechanical difference between heroic and normal. So let's go ahead and talk about that right now. So there really is only one addition to heroic on this encounter, and it's really the key to the entire fight, and that's the ability called Scary Fog. So this is indicated by the large circle that follows Lei Shi around throughout the encounter. You can see it there. And every 7 seconds or so, it's not exactly 7, but it's usually every 7. Any player that's outside of that Scary Fog circle will gain a stack of the Scary Fog debuff. Any players that are within the circle are unaffected by it. They don't gain stacks. So you can see here I'm running out of the circle here, and I'm trying to get another stack of Scary Fog. Now, Scary Fog itself is a 35-second debuff, and it does 6,900 damage per second to that player per stack of the debuff. It can stack up to 20 times at max. So obviously at 20 stacks, that player would take about 138,000 damage per second. So a pretty hefty chunk. Now, in addition to the dot damage, Scary Fog has a benefit. And this is where the key of the fight comes in. For every stack, you will notice there's a small white circle that follows me around as a player afflicted by Scary Fog. You can see our Warlock, well, not anymore really, but the bottom right, our Warlock also is getting stacks of it. Now, any player or enemy that is within this white circle of a Scary Fog afflicted player will take 10% damage increase from all sources while they're within that white circle. And this damage increase stacks for every stack of Scary Fog on the player. So, the basic idea of this encounter to meet the DPS requirement is to utilize Scary Fog as best you can to keep Lei Shi and the ads debuffed, and therefore force them to take 10% extra damage for each stack of Scary Fog on a given player. So the way you do this depends a little bit on your raid makeup, and I'll talk about a few different methods to go about it. But that's the basic idea, is utilize as much Scary Fog stacking as you can to force the animated protectors and Lei Shi, of course, to take extra damage from Scary Fog. Now, it should be noted that Scary Fog stacks from multiple players do not combine into a bigger stack on a target. So instead, any enemy or player, for that matter, will be debuffed equivalent to the maximum Scary Fog stack that is affecting them at the time. So, for example, I have 15 stacks right now, or now 16. So if someone else in there has 1, which quite a few people do, and both of us are standing near the boss, he's not going to get a debuff stack equivalent to 17. Instead, it will just be a 16 stack because that was the maximum stack from any individual that was active at the time. So, the first strategy to handle Scary Fog is what I would refer to as a 10-stack rotation. And this was the sort of the best method on paper. It allows you to keep a constant 10-stack or 100% damage increase on Lei Shi and the protectors throughout the fight. And it doesn't really require extra tanking or extra healing beyond what you need for the normal stuff. So it sort of seems like the best way to go. This was the first method that we tried, but in reality, it did not seem to be the best way to actually finish the fight. So talk about the method we used later. That said, if you want to minimize the amount of tanking and or healing that you need, a 10-stack rotation is a really good way to do it. So the basic method involves using 3 players in rotation. Because the debuff of Scary Fog lasts 35 seconds, and new stacks are applied about every 7 seconds on average. Obviously, if you divide 35-second duration by 7 second restack, you get a 5, stack return. Basically, 5 new stacks can be applied during the duration of a 35-second buff. So, if you use 3 players in a rotation, this means that once you start getting to 10 stacks after a few rounds, you can always have one player inside debuffing Lei Shi or a protector at a 10 stack, while the other 2 players are outside getting stacks at the time. So, I'm not going to bother doing a complicated graphic to explain it. Just basically the idea is have 2 players outside at any given time and 1 player inside debuffing. Once that player that's inside loses their stack or is about to, because it just runs out, that player will step out, start getting new stacks, so they'll start at 0, while the current player that's the highest, which should be at 10 or so, will step in and be the current debuff player. And this process repeats. So when that second player that stepped in is about to lose their stack from it expiring, then the next player in the rotation, which should be the third one, who has the highest Scary Fog stack at the time, around 10, will then step in as the current player steps out. And this process just keeps repeating. Those 3 players have 1 person in at all times, and when they run out, the next person steps in. So mechanically, it's pretty simple. The main problem we found with the 10-stack rotation method was that it just requires more thinking and more reaction from the raid. So basically, because 3 people are involved in it, even though it's not all that complicated, you still have to keep track of things like phase transitions and positioning and who's next in the rotation and all that stuff. The other thing is that, for the most part, the debuff stack is never going to get higher than 10. So because the debuff can go up to 20, theoretically you can actually do more DPS overall to the boss if you are able to have people with higher stacks in some way, getting closer to that 20 mark. And this is, of course, more important as the fight goes on, because Lei Shi will be doing more DPS to the tanks especially, so you want those final phases to go by very quickly, otherwise the tanks could die. So ultimately we found that the 10-stack method was more difficult to put into practice than it was worth, and instead we used the second strategy, which we'll talk about now. So the second strategy, and the one that we settled on, is probably the most common method for this fight, and for good reason. The basic idea is that you utilize a third tank player, so an actual tank spect player, to be the sole manager of Scary Fog throughout the fight. And this has 2 main advantages. The first advantage is that, obviously, with 1 player handling Scary Fog, it's simple to do. The only exception is at the beginning, we also have 1 other player, our Warlock in our case, stay out to get about 5 stacks or so, because, there's really no extra damage to speak of from that, and it will allow us to get the boss debuffed a little bit more often when I'm trying to get stacks. But otherwise, the main advantage is that you can allow the tank player that's getting Scary Fog to climb up in stacks as quickly as possible and reach that 20 mark very early, and still be able to heal them from the damage, since a tank will innately take less damage from the dot than a non-tank player. It's a little bit easier to manage the dot damage. So you can see here, my basic strategy here is to keep gaining the stacks every 7 seconds or so that it reapplies. So I have to sort of bounce in and out of the circle. I'm trying to keep Lei Shi debuffed at all times, but I also don't want to miss a reapplication of a stack, because you want to get to that 20 stack mark as soon as you can within the fight. And this will, of course, just make the debuffs that you're applying that much more potent. So here we're doing a hide phase. We'll talk about that in a bit. But in addition to allowing the tank player to get up to 20 stacks quickly and keep it, The other big advantage, and probably the most important thing about the strategy, is that this method allows you to debuff the protectors with Scary Fog immediately and constantly, so that the protector will die very quickly and the ad phase is very short. And of course, this is important because the ad phase is probably the most dangerous part of this fight. If it lasts too long, DPS will be low. You got ads running around. On heroic, you actually get an extra ad during the phase than you would on normal. So there's just more to deal with in CC. So by having your tank that's handling Scary Fog also be the tank for the protector, you can get through this phase very quickly. So you'll see it here in a moment when we do the next ad phase. But the basic advantage here is that if another player, a non-tank player, was handling Scary Fog, they would have to be very careful not to get too close to the tank that's actually tanking the protector, because otherwise they would debuff that player and cause that player to take, 200% extra damage if you're at 20 stacks. And then that player is going to take huge melee hits from the protector. But Scary Fog does not debuff the player it's active on. Only another person's Scary Fog will debuff you. So you can see here on this protector, I'm able to pick it up. I've got 19 stacks when we engage it. And so I immediately mark it and our DPS starts wailing away on it. And it's going to take 190% extra damage. It dies super fast. And as a tank, I don't take any extra damage from it because my Scary Fog does not debuff me. So I'm just taking normal melee hits from it, plus the dot damage from Scary Fog. But because it dies so quickly, I can utilize, a long duration stun and a cooldown on myself, and it will be dead in a matter of seconds. So that's the huge advantage that you get with this method. So I'm going to assume that most people will use this tank method for Scary Fog, and talk a little bit about some tips for handling it, since, as you see, that's what I was doing here. So I mentioned before, the first thing you should do is try to get your stacks maxed out as early as possible. So the easiest way to do that is to use any forms of movement you have or teleports that allow you to move into range of Lei Shi to debuff, apply the debuff for a few seconds, and then get out of range again, out of the circle, just before that Scary Fog is reapplied. So my basic plan here is to debuff Lei Shi for a few seconds, and then step out again for a Scary Fog when it's about due, and then step in again for a few seconds, step out again for a Scary Fog, and so on. I don't always do it perfectly, but that's the general idea here. And this will just give you as much extra damage as you can on Lei Shi early on before you reach that, 18 or 19 plus stack count. Other than that, the main sources of issue for this encounter are the special phases, or these getaway or hide phases, basically. So there are two things you should focus on. The first is that you want to have Lei Shi debuffed by Scary Fog, your active stack, during the getaway. The problem is that obviously anyone within that white circle of the Scary Fog player, of your tank, will also be debuffed and take 10% extra damage per stack. So you can't really afford to have everyone taking 150% extra damage if that player has 15 stacks while getaway is being cast. It's going to just push everyone away and do massive damage to them because of that extra damage taken. So the best thing that we found to do is to just manage positions so that there's an opening for the Scary Fog tank to debuff Lei Shi during getaway and be in melee range at all times without debuffing other players. So you can see our markers on the ground are sort of indicating this. The red marker is the Scary Fog position. So everyone else tries to stay to the right, sort of, at the purple position. So you can see most of the raid is off to the right of me. And then our tanks are in the front at blue and green respectively, which is just out of range of the splash damage from spray, so they won't get stacks from each other. So this way, at any given time, regardless of when getaway is about to happen, as the Scary Fog player, I can stand on red, safely debuff Lei Shi, and then when Getaway starts, no one else is affected by my debuff stack, and therefore the damage is handled. Now, you should always be within range of Lei Shi during Getaway if you can, as a Scary Fog player, so that the phase ends quickly. If you don't have that debuff going, it's going to take you a long time to do enough damage to Lei Shi. Now, Hide is much the same. You can debuff Lei Shi while she's hidden, and by doing so, you'll AE her quickly and get her out of the phase. The only trick here is that Hide is the only time that Scary Fog is not active, so you can lose your stack during that period if you aren't careful. So the best way to manage this is, because the debuff is 35 seconds, while you're stepping in and out to refresh your stacks, it's usually not a big deal. But once you're at the 20 stack especially, you need to be careful that you don't let your stack get too low when a special is about to happen, because if that special is Hide and you are under 15 seconds or so, you may potentially lose your stack because you can't break her fast enough. So the best thing to do is to make sure you refresh your stack around the time that a special is due if you're below, say, 25 seconds or so. And that will ensure that you have enough time to break her out of Hide and then get out of the circle again and get a reapply, which is what I just did there. And once you're reapplied, you can get back in position and just keep debuffing her and repeat the process. Obviously, during Getaway, like I said, you also want to be in throughout the whole duration. But in an emergency situation, if you have to reapply your stack during Getaway, you can step away for a few seconds to apply that. Your healers should be able to handle the damage with some cooldowns just fine. So that's pretty much it. It's just a matter of getting your stacks going early and often, trying to be inside as much as you can, but then get out when the stack is reapplied, so you get that stack count high quickly. And then once the stack count is high, 17, 18 plus, then spend most of your time inside debuffing Lei Shi. Step out again at 20 or 25 seconds to get a refresh, and then go back inside and repeat the process. Making sure that you get a refresh just before specials in case it happens to be Hide, so you don't lose your stack. And that's the whole process, really. Also, make sure you save your cooldowns as a tank for when you're tanking the Protector, since that's when you're going to take the most spike damage. So, as I said, stuns and then cooldowns after the stun wears off are the best way to do it. Also, make sure you have a method for which target you choose as a Protector so that your DPS can immediately start engaging. So we just pick one closest to the front here, since that's where I'm positioned to get my stacks. And it also ensures that you're not too far or too close to the boss, and therefore not debuffing the normal tanks with your 20 stack so that they don't get destroyed by spray damage, essentially. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. There's not much else to talk about, really. The rest of the fight is just normal mechanics. So you got spray increasing in damage throughout, and the main challenge is getting those stacks up and keeping them active so that you can debuff Lei Shi as much as possible and then meet the Berserk Timer DPS check. So that is good, that is Heroic Lei Shi. Good luck, and thanks for watching.